The lions were napping on the runaway again. I held up a hand against the blazing African sun and stared at the small silver plane that was just minutes away from touching down. I'd have to move the Pride before it landed. "Theo!" I called. The bushman was sitting on the hood of the Land Cruiser, and when he looked my way, I pointed at the 3 lions and 2 cubs sunning themselves on the hard-packed sand. Laughing, he leaned backward and honked the horn of the truck, his way of saying we'd have to chase them off. I nodded and ran back to the cruiser, tossing my folder of papers in the back seat. In a moment, I had the engine roaring and we were off, rattling down the runway towards the sleeping lions. They yawned and chuffed at me in a lazy attempt to scare me off, but I bore down on them. I recognized the Pride. The lionesses were sisters, used to us rambling around the bush. They barely opened their eyes as the truck trundled up to them. I stopped the cruiser, leaving the engine running, and climbed onto the hood. From there, I shouted and waved my arms to the amusement of the cubs, who rolled and yowled and stretched. At last, their mothers lifted themselves up huffingly and ambled off the runway. They were soon lost in the waving golden grass, their tawny coats blending into the dry savanna. Just the black tips of their tails showed, flickering slyly above the foliage, and then those 2 vanished. I drove the truck back to the other end of the runway and parked it, then grabbed my folder out of the back seat. The plane was dropping lower into the sky, lining up with the runway. Theo glanced at me sidelong. He was part bushman, with the lovely golden skin characteristic of his nomadic ancestors, and though he was older than my father, he was no taller than I was. He had found a praying mantis somewhere, and the insect was crawling over his hands from one to the other. As soon as it crawled onto one hand, he lifted the other and placed it in front so that the mantis was continually crawling forward, but getting nowhere. Theo could charm any creature that walked, crawled, flew, or slithered. "You look like you got a toothache, girl," he said. 2 weeks, I murmured, my eyes still on the plane. What are we going to do with 5 teenagers from the city for 2 weeks? "You're a teenager," he grinned, taking far too much delight in my dismay. "I'm sure you will have a grand time." "Yeah, a grand old time." I sank lower into my seat and flipped open the folder, rifling through the documents inside. "I went to school for 3 months in the States once. Did you know that? The kids in my class called me Mowgli and threw bananas at me during lunch." "What is the problem? At the end of the day, it was you who ended up with all the bananas." Theo turned in his seat, and though he was still smiling, his dark eyes were serious. "It will be good for you. You cannot live your whole life with only animals for friends." "I can try," I sighed and shut the folder. "Here they come." The plane touched down in a cloud of dust, its silver sides reflecting golden grass and blue sky. It taxied down the short length and then turned the propeller, whipping up a whirlwind of sand. Theo and I got out of the truck and walked toward the plane, and I had a scarf over my mouth and nose to keep from breathing in the dust. After the engine died and the propeller wound down, the pilot ran around the front of the plane and opened the passenger door. I drew up a deep breath and put on what I hoped to look like a welcoming smile. "And here we go," I muttered through my teeth. An Asian boy with a bright red baseball cap cocked sideways over his long, shaggy hair tumbled out of the plane. The pilot, a young Frenchman named Matthew, was standing at the door and tried to help him out, but the kid ignored him and fell to the ground, where he promptly puked on to the hard-packed sand. I winced and consulted the papers I was carrying, quickly putting the name to our first guest's greenish face. Joey Zhang, from California, 17 years old, Hmong American, listed Sasquatch as his favorite animal. I hoped his sickness was due to the plane ride and not a sign of something worse. The last thing we needed was a flu or malaria in our camp. The nearest hospital was an hour's flight away.